Alright guys, so in this video I'm going to be giving you a little bit of an introduction to section B, which is component 2 section B, which is documentary. It's going to be a little bit of an introduction just to the documentary film genre. So I'm going to be taking a look at things like the generic conventions of documentary, what the purpose of documentary is, or documentary film, I should say, as well as looking at a couple of introductions to some basic theories that talk about documentary types. The theories that we're looking at in here are not the theories that the exam board say you've got to look at as part of the actual spec, but they're ones that are pretty useful for any question you might get on section B. So just a reminder, this is section B of component 2. This is going to be your first 20 marker section that you're going to be looking at. In this section of the exam, we've still got to look at all the core study areas, which is your film form, it's your mise en scène, and the other one, context. But we've also got to look at critical debates, which is going to be on the debate between digital versus manual filming, but also a couple of filmmaker theories as well that we need to look at. These filmmaker theories are not the ones we're going to cover in today's video. I'm going to do a separate video on each of those some other point. So this is your first section of the exam that you've done, which is a 20 marker. So for a 20 marker question, you've only got to answer one question out of 2 options. But what makes this one a bit different is this the first time you're not doing a question that requires you to talk about 2 films. So it's not a comparison question. So the only film you're going to talk about in any essays for section B is Stories We Tell. You might make reference to a couple of other films that we might talk about at some point, but for the most part it's going to be about Stories We Tell. And in the exam board recommend that you spend about 30 minutes on this question, including planning time. You could very well get a question that asks you about any of these things that are on here. So these are any of the study areas. More likely you're going to get a question that asks you about some of these things here, so digital technology or filmmaker theories, just because these are the specialist study areas. You might get a combination of these ones with some of these ones as well, but it's probably more likely to be one of these 2 questions. These are the assessment objectives that you've got to be looking at. Again, this is the same thing we've looked at for the other 2 sections. So assessment objective 1, demonstrate knowledge and understanding of the elements of film. And assessment objective 2, apply knowledge and understanding of elements of film. I'm not going to bother going through this too much because you've done this for every section so far, so that should be pretty straightforward by now. Right, so let's just get straight on to looking at what documentary actually is. And I'm sure you've all seen documentaries before, whether it's a documentary film, so a feature-length documentary, like something like I don't know, any of the films that Michael Moore has done, for example, or whether it's a documentary that you've seen on Netflix, or something like I don't know, one of the ones I like are ones that people like Louis Theroux does, or the ones David Attenborough does. This is a couple of definitions of what documentary film is. So, according to the OED, a non-fictional motion picture intended to document reality primarily for the purposes of instruction, education, or maintaining a historic record. That's a pretty decent definition, but for me, I think in terms of what we're going to look at for Stories We Tell, this one from the Encyclopedia Britannica is a better definition. So it says documentary film shapes and interprets factual material for the purposes of education or entertainment. Now I've put these 2 bits here in bold here, shapes and interprets. I think that in terms of what we need to talk about for Stories We Tell, this bit here is probably the bit that is the most relevant and most useful. So I put both of these on there, but for me, this one here from the Encyclopedia Britannica is a better one. Alright? So, let's quickly start by looking at what the generic conventions are of documentary. And most documentaries do tend to follow a pretty similar look and style to them. So for starters, the mise en scène and cinematography. For starters, there is much less of an element of construction with the mise en scène of a documentary. It's meant to be real locations, real people, real situations, and if it isn't really any of those things, it's not really a documentary, because what is it documenting? So you get real sets, or not even sets, or real locations, real people, in as much as they realistic sense as you possibly can. To support that, natural lighting. Yes, if you're doing something like maybe an interview with someone, you might get a little bit of 3-point lighting, maybe you might get a little bit of artificial lighting, but for the most part it's going to be natural lighting. You get a lot of handheld cinematography as well. Again, it maintains that sense of realism, it gives the impression that you're actually in the location that you are set as well. Harsh lighting, we've just spoken about, with one light source, and you get a lot of establishing shots and close shots as well, but realistically that's about it. There doesn't tend to be much variation of cinematography techniques in documentary because that's not the point of it. It doesn't feel real. In addition to that though, you do get a lot of different types of footage in documentaries as well. You don't often just get the same types over and over and over again. So you might get actuality footage. So if your documentary is telling a story of something that has happened, maybe like a news event or something, you might get actual footage of those events taking place. So something like, I don't know, news footage maybe, or footage that has been shot at an actual event that is being documented, like an event or something maybe. So something like, I don't know, I'm not seeing it because I'm not really the audience, but some of the footage that you might get from the Taylor Swift Eras documentary that's out at the moment, or is it documentary? I don't really know, to be honest, I've not seen it. But you also might get archival footage. So archival footage is footage that has been taken from an archive. So it might be historical footage, it might be footage that's been shot by someone else, it might be footage taken from a news report, or it might be some footage taken from another documentary maybe. These are the ones that you do tend to see very commonly in documentaries, especially ones that are about a specific thing, or a specific person, or a specific story. So interviews and vox pops. So interviews, obviously I don't need to explain what an interview is, but vox pops, short for vox populi, or populi, I don't know how you pronounce that, populi maybe, doesn't matter. This is where you basically get a series of random people asking for their opinion or their voices on whatever it is you're talking about. They're not quite as common. You see them a lot in news stories maybe, but you do tend to get interviews and vox pops. And then finally, reenactments. So this is where a film crew will reenact an event that has already happened and shoot it as if this is the actual thing that is taking place. So you will use actual actors for this, you will use actual film crews with production values akin to an actual film or a TV program, but its purpose is to reenact something that you might not necessarily have footage of. But then that all comes back into play of the whole idea of how real is that, but we'll come back to that later on. Performance is worth looking at as well. Now again, performance is something that we're going to do quite a lot about when we start looking at stories we tell, because we'll be looking at to what extent are the people who are presented to us in the film being themselves, or are they performing to the camera. So we will also look at the role of the documentarian and the person actually making the documentary in this as well. Are they seen in the film? Are they a presence that is on camera, or we can maybe hear them asking questions maybe? So someone like Louis Theroux might be a good example of that. But also things like, are they direct or indirect interviews? Does documentarian do pieces to the camera? So that's where you might get the actual documentary, the documentary maker who is actually answering questions and talking to the camera and addressing the audience. So there'll be a lot of stuff that will. The last one, I think this one's quite important as well. The persona of the documentarian. They're trying to, create a certain personality. Maybe a lot of documentary makers, they have a distinct personality that helps reflect their style. So someone again like Louis Theroux would be a good example of that, because he's got that whole shtick of being the bumbling, harmless English, posh documentary maker, which he stole off, I can't remember his name, the guy who stole it off. It's on one of the other videos, never mind. But also as well, the whole idea of the style of the documentary as well. You know, does it use fly on the wall techniques, and does that impact on how people perform? You know, one of the things you've got to be thinking about is, do people act differently if they know they've got a camera pointed at them? You know, is what we're seeing a performer. Nick Broomfield, that's the guy. Sorry, just come back to me now. That's the guy who Louis Theroux ripped off. Anyway, what's talking about? Oh yeah, fly on the wall stuff. Editing tends to be very simple and very, you know, more done for continuity rather than, you know, experimental non-continuity techniques. And you do see a lot of reverse shot structure, especially if someone's being interviewed. You might get shots of the subject answering the questions, and you might get the reverse shot of the interviewer nodding along, which is called noddies. Montage sequences as well. You get a lot of montage sequences, a lot of long takes, cutaways you might get as well. So cutting away to something else with a voiceover. Again, a lot of these are examples that you see in Stories We Tell. The selective editing, we'll come back to that a bit more when we look at Stories We Tell. I mean, cross-cutting as well can be quite a simple, straightforward one. And in graphics and captions, you know, you might have, you know, some person pop up on screen who is being interviewed, or you might get a little caption that explains who they are and what their relationship is with the subject matter. And again, sound, it's quite straightforward really. Voiceovers, you do tend to get a lot of those voiceovers tend to be from the actual documentary maker themselves, but not necessarily. You know, you could get a voiceover from someone like a Louis Theroux character who is involved in the actual making of the documentary. But again, it might also be what's called a voice of God narrator, or it might be someone like David Attenborough maybe. Minimal music as well. The music is obviously, it often reflects the actual subject of the documentary as well. And then a lot of the dialogue is attempted again to be naturalistic. So you will get a lot of scripted aspects of it, especially in voiceovers, but you might get a lot of unscripted aspects to it as well, especially during interview processes when you're interviewing subjects. Right, so the next thing we need to look at are a couple of basic theories regarding documentary. So these are not the key theories that the exam boards say we've got to look at, but these are the theories that are quite useful as like a background understanding of documentary itself. So Michael Renoff, this geezer here, he spoke about there are 4 fundamental tendencies of documentary. All right, so these are what the aims of documentaries are. Alright, what's the purpose of them essentially? So the first one is to record, reveal, or preserve. So this could be something like a news-related documentary where the role of the documentary is just to basically tell the facts. What's happening, or what happened, when did it happen, how did it happen, why did it happen, etc., etc. Second one is to persuade or promote. Now these tend to be documentaries that are on quite contentious issues. So it might be something like maybe a documentary that has a certain viewpoint. You know, it might be something like a political documentary maybe. It might be something like, a documentary is trying to encourage the watcher to think a certain way, or believe a certain way, or think a certain way, or take a certain angle of a particular story. Third one, to analyse or interrogate. Now again, these quite similar to the second one, but these are documentaries that tend to aim to challenge someone about something. You know, it might be that, you're trying to criticise someone for something they may have done, and you're doing it through the making of a documentary. You know, it might be looking at a subject, and it might be analysing that particular subject matter. So something like Bowling for Columbine, for example, is an analysis on American gun control laws. If you haven't seen that, I'd recommend it. It's a really, really good documentary. And the final one, to express. These ones tend to be the ones that are a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? Arty, I suppose. A little bit more sort of, expressionistic, so maybe some of the early documentaries might fall into something like this, or maybe something along the lines of Man with a Movie Camera by Ziga Vertov, one of the most groundbreaking documentaries ever made. Right, another important one, Bill Nichols, and he talks about the various modes of documentary. So he spoke about documentaries being poetic, expository, participatory, observational, reflexive, or performative. Now, not all of these are going to be relevant for what it is we need to focus on, but some of them are quite useful. So, poetic documentaries, these again are similar to documentaries that tend to express. So that, again, the example for this one, the really famous example, would be something like Man with a Movie Camera, because they are non-linear, they're non-narrative, they're basically just a series of montage sequences, and then the spectator will construct the meaning through their interpretation of those montage sequences. Expository documentaries, these are documentaries that have a clear point of view. They are telling you something. It's saying this happened, this is what you need to believe. They have a clear angle. So again, something like many of the Michael Moore documentaries would be examples of expository documentaries. Participatory documentaries, this is where the filmmaker is seen on screen. So again, something like Louis Theroux would be a good example of this, Nick Broomfield, Michael Moore, Sarah Polley for Stories We Tell would be an example of this as well. Observational documentaries, or cinema verite techniques, this is where the filmmaker is not seen. So something like Senna would be a good example of that. I can't remember who made Senna, but that's a very good example. Amy as well, the documentary about Amy Winehouse, that's a very, very good example of that. A lot of the Netflix documentaries tend to be observational documentaries. We don't see the filmmakers themselves, we just see the people who are involved in that particular story. What have we got next? Reflexive documentaries. Now these are less common, but this one I think is essential for Stories We Tell. Alright, so we'll have another look at this when we've actually watched the film. So these are documentaries that are very postmodern, they're very self-aware, and they draw attention to the filmmaking process. So in Stories We Tell, we see the documentary being made. We see the camera operators, we see the recording of the voiceovers. So it's deliberately drawing your attention to the fact that you are watching a film and you're watching something that has been constructed. Now we'll go back and look at this a bit more, why documentarians might do this a little bit later on, but that's a really, really important one. And then finally, again, this is really important for Stories We Tell, performative documentaries. Now these are documentaries that are about the filmmaker themselves. It might be about their own experiences, it might be about something that's happened to them, it might be subject matter that is very close to their hearts, maybe. Something that is a personal journey, maybe. But again, really important for Stories We Tell, this one. So a little bit more on postmodern documentaries or reflexive documentaries. This basically all comes back to the whole idea of, to what extent are we aware that the documentary is telling us the truth or not? Because if you think about documentaries, it is still a constructed film. It has still been put together in a certain way. And usually that's to try and make us think or act a certain way or take a certain viewpoint. But how do we know that what we're watching is the truth? How do we believe that? Alright, but again, that is something that we're going to look at a bit more when it comes to looking at Stories We Tell. Again, personal documentaries as well. Stories We Tell is a very good example of a personal documentary. You find this in autobiographical documentaries. So maybe something like Amy, the documentary about Amy Winehouse, which I mentioned before. Even to some extent, some of the documentaries that you're seeing more and more of on Netflix at the moment. So there's that new one, isn't it, about David Beckham at the moment, which I've got no interest in watching. They're documentaries about a person. But this is a good little quote from Sarah Polly here that says, "Personal documentaries have always made me a bit squeamish. I've seen some brilliant ones, but they often push the boundaries of narcissism and can feel more like a form of therapy than actual filmmaking." So, it feels like she's basically arguing there that these documentary platforms serve as an opportunity for someone to basically show off, or maybe even to sort of, challenge things maybe. So I think, if you're someone who's very cynical like me, you might look at that new David Beckham documentary that's just been put onto Netflix as a way for David Beckham to try and make everyone forget about the fact that he was someone who was a massive LGBTQ plus icon, who then took loads of money to, big up Qatar before the Qatar World Cup maybe. But that's just me being very cynical. Another little quote there as well from Linda Williams, who is a famous film professor at one American university, I can't remember. Such films, again this is on personal documentaries, such films challenge viewers to recognise that truth exists in context in relation to lies and are a selected form of other truths, going beyond the reflexivity that is calling attention to the fact that the film is a film. Such films posit that there are important truths to be revealed, and that they can be revealed in spite of, or even calling attention to, the partiality of our understanding. That's quite a long quote, but it all comes back to that idea of, to what extent do documentaries tell the truth? Is it the truth, or is it someone's interpretation of the truth? Is it someone's version of the truth? And how do we know that that person's version of the truth is the truth or not? Will we ever know? So that's one thing we're really going to be looking at a lot when we look at stories we tell. And that's the whole idea of, is there such a thing as unobjective documentary truth? Alright, that's the big thing that this documentary is arguing about. So, that's just a quick introduction to documentary. A few little really good key terms in there that you need to make a note of, and all those theories are really important as well. If there's anything in here that you didn't quite understand, give me a shout. Come and see me or Rob. Send us an email, you know where to find us. But other than that, that's pretty much it for this time, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.